Huh? Hello all. Didn't see you there. It's been a little bit. You been well? I hope you'll forgive me for my absence. I've been studying and doing research in grad school for hopefully the last time I'll ever have to in my life and adapting to a new job. Indeed, by the time I put this video up, I'll probably have been put through the ringer, so while that's all going on, I thought I'd revisit perhaps my favorite currently active rock band out there today. You know, keep myself sane by talking about something I love. Today, we're returning to Australia to take a look at one of the most insane psychedelic rock bands to emerge in the past few decades. A group of genre-hopping lads who may be spoken one day in the same breath as not just the Grateful Dead and Fish, but Motorhead and AC/DC as well. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. For y'all who don't know, King Gizzard are an Australian psychedelic rock band formed in Melbourne back in 2010 by good friends Stu McKenzie, Ambrose Kenny Smith, Joey Walker, Cookie Craig, Lucas Harwood, Michael Cavs Kavanagh, and Eric Moore. Thanks in part to both an independent music empire constructed by Eric in the form of Flightless Records and an absurd work ethic, these boys have penetrated into the zeitgeist of contemporary music and created a cult following in a way that few other rock bands seem to have done, all while playing by essentially their own rules. They inspire me so hard every day in what they do. Just a bunch of lads making music and going from continent to continent playing bangers and this is the especially crucial part of the story, getting better and more mature as musicians while doing so. Since their formation 13 years ago, they've put out not 1, not 2, not 5, not even 10 albums, but goddamn 23. And with each one, you can hear the band members experimenting with some new sound or another, trying to in turn incorporate something further into their musical toolboxes for later. Now, as I implied earlier, I've made content on my channel before covering King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Back in 2021, I ranked all their studio albums up to and including their then latest album Butterfly 3000 in a live stream. For the most part, I still largely stand by the opinions of that stream, but times have changed. Since then, with music venues and studios once again opening up, King Gizzard have been spoiling us both with their studio output and generous touring schedules. And folks, we are eating good. So, I think my tier list is due for an update, not only to account for the new era of Giz, but also because that older tier list was in my unprofessional one-take stream, poor audio bounce days, and I want to assure the people who are still commenting on those VODs bringing that to my attention that, yes, I see you, I wish I could correct the past 2. Instead, I'll have to settle for remaking it. But, because I don't want this video to be like over 3 goddamn hours long, I'm going to intentionally limit myself here. Yes, I'll recap all the albums through 2021 to explain my tier rationales, but 1, I'm still only going to be covering the studio albums. No EPs, no Bandcamp bootlegs, no live albums. I might mention some of them here or there as I feel fit, but for the most part I'll be taking a purist approach to album chronology here. And then 2, I'm giving myself 5 sentences or less to explain and review each album. I'm hoping that's going to help cap what I say in the following section, but, well, given my tendency for long run-on sentences with em-dashes and parentheticals, we'll see. So now then, ladies, fellas, people who don't give a fuck, won't you join me as I take you down a rabbit hole the contours of which I've become intimately acquainted with since falling down it myself in 2017. Allow me to present to you In their first 2 years as a band, the septet was very meat and potatoes garage rock with a little surf and blues influence. Their debut album, 2012's 12-Bar Bruise, is perhaps the pinnacle of that sound, full of straightforward bangers like Elbow, Sea of Trees, and Footy Footy.
Kick the ball! Kick the butt!
as well as some more experimental moments like the title track recorded on 4 iPhones, flirtation with the psychedelic on 9, and a full-on mini-western audiobook in Sam Cherry's Last Shot. It's an impressive first effort overall, but there are a few tracks which are either a little forgettable or juvenile. Definitely a charming album though, so I'm putting it in B tier. Also, if you check this out afterwards and like it, I recommend the EP released prior to this, Willoughby's Beach, which would probably be a B if I ranked it.
The bad white men call him the devil. The Yavapai call him Eyes Like the Sky.
Next, in the first of many left-field turns in this band's dense history, they decided to return to the spaghetti western sound they'd established on Sam Cherry's Last Shot for an entire album. Eyes Like the Sky, released on February 22nd of 2013. This album is a collaboration with Broderick Smith. He's the narrator and lyricist for the album, former vocalist of Australian country band The Dingoes, and father of Ambrose. And damn, does his voice sound cool paired with some of the soundscapes on the album. There are a lot of really cool sonic textures that immerse you on the album's western setting, and I especially love the opening run of the first 3 songs, the title track, Year of Our Lord, and The Raid. After that, though, and especially after the midway point in the album, you kinda get the idea, and it gets a bit less interesting. Though it's a fun little pet project from a frontman obsessed with Red Dead Redemption, you gotta be in that western sort of mood to really enjoy it in its entirety, so I'll put it in C tier. Instead of becoming a dedicated spaghetti western band, the Giz Boys then decided to plunge even further into psychedelic rock, fiddling with some sitars in a few home studios in Victoria the summer of 2013 before dropping their 3rd album, Float Along, Fill Your Lungs. It's here where the band's psychedelic potential comes into focus, perhaps no better demonstrated than on the monstrous, unrelenting 60-minute garage psych opener Head on Pill. The rest of the album is great too, loaded with some quality pop psychedelia on songs like 30 Past 7, Let Me Mend the Past, and Pop in My Step. Really, my one big problem with the album is a matter of balance. Head on Pill takes up the first third of the album's runtime, and while it's great if you're in the mood, some days it can get to be a bit much midway through, and you may just want to skip to the shorter tracks. Regardless, this album is a fun time with some good songwriting, so I'm putting it in A tier. Released on March 7th, 2014, Odd Mints is King Gizzard's first of what I'll call their potpourri albums, or rather the ones which don't adhere to any strict theme or genre from track to track. In the case of the tracks from this album, they were all leftovers from the sessions from the first 3 albums, and that wouldn't be so bad if not for the fact that, good God, the production sucks for some of these songs. This, combined with the lack of stylistic consistency from track to track like on previous albums, makes Odd Mints almost annoying to listen through. I mean, when it's good, it's great. It's got Old, Stressin', and Work This Time are some of the better low-key tunes the band's written, and Hot Wax, in its lyrical and sonic absurdity, rules. But no, this album is probably Giz's first real clunker. D tier. Oh, now we're really getting to the good stuff. After months of rehearsing and recording in proper studios for the first time, King Gizzard put out their 5th album, I'm in Your Mind Fuzz, on Halloween of 2014, and people, the Gizzard sound has arrived. At this album's highest octane moments, like the first 4 tracks or Am I in Heaven, the band let loose with ever-pounding motoric beats, harmonica wails, feedback shrieks, and whoops and howls from Stu McKenzie, refining the chaotic back half of Head on Pill into a killer attack. The rest of the album is just as interesting, though, between the jaunty, flute-driven jank of both Empty and Hot Water, and the mellow, heady run of the final 3 tracks. I still think this album is a perfect introduction into the various sides of this band's usual psychedelic domain, so it's the first album I'm going to rank in S tier. In the months after Mind Fuzz, the boys began to explore a more mellow, jazz-rocky sound and decided to incorporate that into their next album, Quarters, released May 1st, 2015. Now, as the album's title, cover art, and track listing imply, the gimmick here is that the album's 40-minute, 40-second runtime is divided evenly into 4 10-minute, 10-second tracks. Opening track, The River, is probably the best execution upon this concept, weaving between a swinging 5/4 section, a Latin-tinged breakdown, and a funky ending jam over the course of its runtime in such a way that always keeps the listener on the edge of their seat. The remainder of the album, though, just sort of meanders on a few static chord patterns, which is a shame because they're really chill patterns that give rise to neat moments. Most of the album blends together, and it can be a chill listening experience, especially with a bit of catnip, but this is definitely not the best set of songs the band has ever recorded, so it's going in C tier. For their second album of 2015, Paper Mache Dream Balloon, released on November 13th, King Gizzard decided to create an album with entirely acoustic instrumentation. This album is cute and charming as heck, y'all. The layers of harmony the band are able to create from piano, flute, clarinet, harmonica, and a number of acoustic stringed instruments are sublime, as Dirt, the title track, and Time is Money perhaps best exemplify. Far from just being pretty, though, the album cycles through a number of different interesting moods, from the heady blues of the Bitter Boogie to the kooky, Scooby-Doo-ish horror numbers Cold Cadaver, Trapdoor, and NGRI. This album is great, but it's one of the furthest albums from the band's usual wheelhouse of their heavier, more psychedelic roots, so it's hard for me to give it too high a ranking. I'm going to put it in A tier. After a year in the making, during which the band nearly broke up from infighting, Nonagon Infinity, King Gizzard's 8th album, came out on November 29th, 2016. Though this album's concept nearly pushed them to their breaking point to realize, oh god, was it well worth the struggle. As its name implies, it consists of 9 tracks which all seg into each other and thus loop endlessly. Not only is the album's opening run of 4 tracks one of the most incredible runs on any rock album I've ever heard, but somehow they basically managed to keep that same raw, driving energy for the entire album, only deviating with the quirky Mr. Beat and the experimental samba breakdown of Invisible Face. If you consider yourself a fan of rock music in the year 2023, punk, prog, metal, doesn't matter. You owe it to yourself to listen to this record all the way through, and maybe again, and again, and hell, again! For all intents and purposes, Nonagon Infinity is King Gizzard's magnum opus. S tier, no question. Their creative faculties drained and pushed to their breaking point, King Gizzard would uncharacteristically not put out another album in 2016, before characteristically announcing at the end of the year that they would be dropping a whopping 5 albums in 2017. God damn! The first of these, Flying Microtonal Banana, came out on February 24th, 2017, and as its cover and title imply, it is the band's first foray into microtonal tuning, which, to explain in brief, brings out pitches between the 12 notes we typically use in Western music. The result is a rustic sound which fuses the band's typical motoric drive with inventive, noodly Eastern-sounding melodies, perhaps best exemplified on lead-off track Rattlesnake, Sleep Drifter, and Billabong Valley. But there are a few other tracks which toy with funkier grooves like Melting, Nuclear Fusion, and Anoxia, which also rule. My one big criticism here is again with pacing, in that the first 3 tracks of the album take up a third of its runtime, so the album demands a lot from the listener up front. Spend some time with it though, and you'll come to find that Flying Microtonal Banana is a damn good first impression of the band's microtonal ambitions. A tier.
I know I see an altered beast by the creek.
If you thought at all when I mentioned their 5 albums in 2017 goal that King Gizzard were going to coast on a single sound for the entire year, then you'll be delighted to know that, oh no, they had some even crazier shit cooking. On June 23rd, they dropped Murder of the Universe, a double album consisting of 3 multi-part musical suites narrated by folk singer and Flightless labelmate Leia Sr., and a natural reader text-to-speech application with such batshit titles as The Tale of the Altered Beast, The Lord of Lightning vs. Balrog, and Hantayumi and the Murder of the Universe. It's basically what would happen if you took the sonic power of Nonagon Infinity and merged it with the very best Dungeons & Dragons roleplay, and it is just so good. So fucking good. I love the shit out of this album. Some people think that the narration takes away from the album's intensity, but respectfully, I disagree. I think it adds to the drama and corny sincerity of scenarios like people transforming into altered beasts and a cyborg vomiting so hard it drowns the entire universe. This is my personal favorite King Gizzard album, and an easy S tier. For their third album of 2017, King Gizzard decided to collaborate with Chicago-based jazz rock band Mild High Club, who they toured with a few times in the past. The result, Sketches of Brunswick East, came out on August 18th, and it's pretty good. As the title implies, it's a jazzy, impressionistic sketch of Melbourne with some stellar keys work from Mild High Club's Alex Breton, perhaps best exemplified in the slick grooves of Countdown, The Spider and Me, and Rolling Stoned. My biggest problem with the album is that, for the most part, its transitory instrumental tracks don't really hold up when you listen to them on their own, meaning there's a lot of ostensible album filler, just loose jamming. Overall, it's another commendable foray into jazz and more jammy songwriting from the Melbourne Septet, but again hobbled in its execution, so I'm going to put it in B tier. At this point, a few months from the end of the year, you might expect King Giz to take things easy and try to make some more straightforward garage rock for their final 2 albums of 2017, but nope! The 4th album of the year, Polygondwanaland, came out on November 20th in the public domain, no less, and is the band's most overt progressive rock endeavor, perhaps, to date. Much like Murder of the Universe, this one can be divided up into a few different suites of music exploring different science fiction scenarios, but the sound is less driving garage rock and more polymeter-based and synth-textured. The album's opening track, Crumbling Castle, is an undeniable epic of a track and, in fact, was the song that got me into Giz. But the rest of the album has nary a dull moment either, bouncing from the ascending sequencers in Castle in the Air to the multi-layered groove of Inner Cell, which I still cannot wrap my head around as a drummer, to the soaring transition from Searching into the Fourth Color, which, I imagine, is what it sounds like when you reach enlightenment. And through it all, through all the precise acoustic guitar licks, through all the cascading synth patterns, through all the flawless transitions from time signature to time signature, you can't help but remember these are the same Aussie lads who sang about football and accidentally calling mom 5 years prior. Not only is Polygondwanaland an incredible album, but a crucial milestone in King Gizzard's technical ability as musicians. S tier for sure. Somehow, amid their continued touring commitments for the rest of 2017, the bands were able to make good on their promise and drop a 5th album, Gumboot Soup, just before the year let out on December 31st. The kicker is that, unfortunately, this is another potpourri album consisting of rejected tracks from the other 4 albums that year, and so it is, like Oddments before it, another disjointed listen from front to back, bouncing between dreamy jazz pop one track and microtonal metal the next. It is marginally better than Oddman's, if only because the members of Giz were now much better producers and songwriters, as is perhaps most apparent on Gambling Cautionary Tale Beginner's Luck, Shanty-like Stomper Muddy Water, and the full-on stoner metal pastiche The Great Chain of Being. That said, you can definitely tell why a few of these were left off the other albums. The Last Oasis and Greenhouse Heat Death are underbaked sketches and Flying Banana respectively, while Superposition is an admirable, if very primitive, experiment on Joey Walker's behalf in creating a synth-centered tune. Overall, Gumboot Soup has some good cuts on it, but it's still a very disjointedly paced outtake album, so I have to put it in C tier. After the hurricane of activity that was 2017, King Gizzard would choose to spend all of 2018 on the road, playing to all the new fans they'd attracted instead of constantly pumping out albums. But they did begin to make music moves sometime over the summer, shacking up at the home studios of fellow Melbourne band Tropical Fuckstorm for some writing and recording. These sessions would eventually result in the band's 14th album, Fishing for Fishies, which would release on April 26, 2019, and shit, man, I'm honestly of a mixed mind about it. I do like how there's a very strong environmentalist undercurrent in both the lyrics and music of the album, as it moves from the acoustic folk title track to the pulsating synth pop of Psy Boogie, incorporating more layers of electronics along the way. And I love cuts like the irreverent Plastic Boogie, the psychedelic pop of Real's Not Real, and the thumping This Thing. All the same, aside from the band's continued embrace of synths and sequencers, the album's tracks don't really push the envelope of the Gizzard sound in the way a lot of albums in the past few years had, falling back largely on their bluesier sounds, and I have to be in a cheery, summery mood to listen to it the entire way through, which I've not often felt since 2019 for obvious reasons. I'm sorry, Fishies, I think I'm gonna have to bump you down to C tier. Now this album, on the other hand, has aged like a fine goddamn wine. Largely the work of Stu, Joey, and Cavs, Infest the Rat's Nest, released on August 19, 2019, is King Gizzard's first out-and-out metal album, complete with hammering double kick drum, horse lead vocals, and thrash riff upon goddamn thrash riff. It's also another environmentalist concept album, not only telling the dystopian story of an Earth succumbing to climate change, cannibalism, and a deadly pandemic. What did they see and when? But 2 failed colonization missions to the harsh climate of Venus. Honestly, I can't think of a more perfect fusion of concept and music, and it lends well to some powerful moments like Planet B's dire clarion call in its chorus for climate action, the mournful harmonica at the end of Perihelion, and the fracturing mental state of our would-be Venusian colonists on Self-Immolate.
Like a bird in a cage, aerostat habitat, to motion I am slave, give me hell, I want that.
Part of my opinion might be tainted by my bias since I have fond memories of the album's promotional cycle and have always favored when Giz go a bit more balls to the wall, but this is yet another S for me. 2020 began optimistically for Giz, what with 2 new albums under their belt and their momentum growing ever larger overseas. But then the Australian bushfires hit, and then COVID shut everything down for the better part of a few years, and then Eric left the band to focus on running Flightless Records. Their backs to the wall after this triple whammy, King Gizzard decided to return to Microtones and make some new music in self-isolation, resulting in the release of their 16th album, KG, on November 20th. This album was a bit of a grower on me, but I've come to see it as some of the band's best microtonal work to date, flowing from track to track with the elegance and ease of Nonagon Infinity, but with the musical variety of, an Oddman's. You'll go from, an acoustic introduction 1 minute to the progressive desert rock of Automation and Minimum Brain Size the next, followed by the frail acoustic jam of Straws in the Wind, the afro-jazz of Some of Us, the soaring harmonica hook of Ontology, the electronic blur meets Snake Charmer groove of Inner Sport, the cascading guitar leads in Odd Life, the sweet acoustic love song Honey, the crushing doom metal of The Hungry Wolf of Fate, and it all blends together seamlessly. For an album conceived and recorded during lockdown especially, this album is brimming with such life and creativity and shows King Gizzard mastering the microtonal melodies they've been toying with for 4 years. It belongs in S tier. Given that KG's title is one half of the band's name initialized and it literally ends on an interrupted transitionary sound, fans were quick to speculate that we would get a follow-up LW album with even more microtones, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened, with the band dropping the LW shoe on February 25th the following year. Now, see, I like to think of King Gizzard's current trilogy of microtonal albums much like the original Star Wars trilogy. The first one was a great first attempt, the second perfected and expanded upon the first's winning formula, and the third is almost definitely a letdown compared to the previous two. Don't get me wrong, I love a lot of the tracks in LW, like the energetic duology of One and Clara, the rustic folk funk of Static Electricity, and the closer KGLW, an 8-minute stoner metal reprise of KG's intro, where the bands literally embrace their cult status and chant their initials. That said, a lot of the transitions between songs are quite weak, with the songs often just ending and then going right into the next. And some songs are just weak outright, like the meandering, tool-aspiring Ataraxia and See Me, which is literally just a worse Odd Life. LW is not a bad album, just an uneven one and a disappointing conclusion to a banger trilogy, so I'm putting it in B tier. After playing a few microtonal shows in Australia during a lull in the pandemic, the band announced in May a new album, one built on modular synth loops called Butterfly 3000, to be released the following month. Now, when I did my original studio album tier list stream on this channel, it was only 2 weeks after this album released on June 11th, so my opinion of the album was still settling, but I noted that the band produced fascinating soundscapes with their creative melding of modular synths, acoustic instruments, and keyboards that work better on some songs than others. The album starts strong with the bouncy Yours and the immaculate Tame Impala-like vibes of Shanghai before sorta trailing off with Dreams and Blue Morpho, which, though two sides of the same coin, kinda just blend into each other with their repetitive melodies. You know, that's what I've kinda come to notice more about the album over the past 2 years. Quality-wise, it's like a roller coaster. Because you have that initial sequence, then it gets better with Interior People, and especially Song of the Summer Every Summer Catching Smoke, then bland again with 2.02 Killer Year, before finishing with an upswing in the final 3 tracks. As King Gizzard's most synth-heavy album to date, Butterfly 3000 was a bold swing, but in the years since, it's held up about as good as King Gizzard's earliest guitar-heavy albums. That is to say, B tier. Okay! Woo! That's it for the recap portion. How are we doing? Jesus Christ! 8 pages?! Fuck, man, we're not even at the main event yet, the deep dive subject of the day. You see, by the end of 2021, with the Western world steadily emerging from lockdown and the previous 11 years worth of tours and 18 albums under their belt, King Gizzard were once again ready to take the world by storm. The thing is, with the departure of Eric from the band to run Flightless, since he was their manager, King Gizzard were basically on their own now. It's unclear what happened behind the scenes between Eric and the rest of the guys, but from Butterfly 3000 onward, the band had been releasing albums on their own label, KGLW, and presumably running their own merch business. And oh boy, have they been getting down to business. Not only have they been putting out the usual shirts and colored vinyl, but in December of 2020, the band launched a bootlegging program allowing indie labels to press their own vinyl of various live recordings and demos the band have made available over the past few years, with the condition that said labels then offer a few copies for King Gizzard to sell on their own merch site, Gizverse. Not only were the band looking to resume business as usual then, but it seemed like they were going even further still, encouraging a bootlegging empire on par with your Grateful Deads or Fishes of old. However, 2022, in hindsight, was something of a make-or-break moment for the band, I think. They booked so many dates in Australia, Europe, and North America throughout the year. And what's more, though the Gizzard fanbase didn't know it going into 2022, the band would once more drop 5 albums in a single year. Essentially, they were attempting a similar gambit to 2017, but running their own show rather than operating under the Flightless banner. Could they still pull it off? Could they continue to evolve artistically as before while managing themselves? Where could they go? Well, when you look at the albums they put out this past year and the further maturity of the band's musical chemistry becomes apparent, another question calls back. Where couldn't they go? But sadly, before we answer that question, we need to talk about the saga of... As is perhaps fitting for this section of the video, we need to first go back in time. In the pre-lockdown days of late 2019 and early 2020, King Gizzard were once more making plans to come to America, but this time with 15 albums under their belt, the band got the idea to perform 2 separate 3-hour marathon shows, one at Berkeley, California's Greek Theater and the other at the famous Red Rocks Amphitheater in Morrison, Colorado. Now, the band had done marathon sets before. I think, especially during and for a little bit after 2017, there were a few shows they'd done with one set dedicated to microtonal songs and the other dedicated to everything else. In fact, in response to the Australian bushfires, the band held a benefit concert in Melbourne on February 21st, 2020, which was something of a dry run for future marathon shows. But there was a lot of hype around these upcoming American marathon shows, especially the one at Red Rocks. Even the bands were feeling it themselves. It soon got to the point where they wanted to compose their own intermission music to give fans a little treat to listen to in between sets while going to get another beer or taking a piss. So they started conceptualizing music which incorporated a ticking clock throughout as an additional beat, and before you know it, hey, what do you know, mates, we got ourselves a potential new album. Unfortunately, that album would get shelved for the time being when COVID made touring and thus the marathon sets impossible. Of course, that wouldn't stop the band from teasing it for the next year or so, conducting 2 Reddit AMAs under the name Made in Timeland. Naturally, with the Gizzard fanbase having grown accustomed, shall we say, to King Gizzard's usual game of referencing past songs and teasing future ones by this point, people were frothing at the goddamn mouth for this album, this mythical Timeland. At last, a few months after Butterfly 3000 was dropped, King Gizzard announced a Timeland festival in Talarook for New Year's Eve of 2021.
First one's here we go, let's go!
Yoo-hoo! La 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 la.
Wait. Who the hell is that?
I've seen that before.
I slept in that tent before,
I know them
motherfucker.
chairs.
Hey,
What the hell?
I guess we gotta check this out now.
Sleeping printer. Excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me.
And it was soon confirmed that yes, Made in Timeland did exist and it would be given out to festival attendees. The King Gizzard fanbase was euphoric. People were flying in from not just all over Australia, but around the world to attend the festival, to lay gaze upon the land of time. So naturally, COVID had to flare up around Australia again around this time and can the entire thing outright. Of course, the band were generous enough to offer refunds, but I can remember there were still a lot of people upset by the sudden cancellation. Hell, I kinda was too. It would have been cheeky and cute if they put out a surprise 3rd album before the year ended, but alas. That said, Timeland could no longer be contained. In their rush to get in one more album before the end of the year, the band sent off copies of the Made in Timeland vinyl to record shops around the world prematurely, and it started popping up for sale as soon as January. From there it leaked online and, well, King Giz had a bit of egg on their face. On February 17th, with their tongues firmly in cheek, they announced a 3-hour marathon set in Melbourne for the following month called The Return of the Curse of Timeland. And it actually came to pass on March 5th when Made in Timeland was also finally given out at the concert and simultaneously released on the band's own website. Streaming platforms would need another few months. And after all this fuss, all this constant teasing, you might be wondering, how's the actual music? Right, so we've got 2 tracks, both 15 minutes each, and there's certainly intermission music, alright. Like I said earlier, both songs were made to go with a countdown timer and play with a constant 60 BPM pulse going on in the background, and I think that idea is fascinating in concept, but in execution here, It's all over the goddamn place. Sections of music will come and go with seemingly little connection. The 60 BPM pulse sometimes makes for great polyrhythms, but other times hypnotically dull grooves. Both songs end quite abruptly, and some of the stuff the Giz Boys did here is just... What the hell is going on here? Well, as Stu would later explain in a Reddit AMA, Timeland was all about vignettes. Each vignette was mostly recorded by one individual member, then brought to the band for overdubs and additional ideas. I had the task of splicing them together into a cohesive piece. It was a fun way to make music. I mean, it's certainly a way of making music. I've never composed music out of vignettes myself, so I can't attest to the fun aspect. But I'm sorry, Stu, the album suffers for it. I don't even really know how to approach talking about this album. Yeah, like I said, there are 2 tracks, but they mostly kind of just blend into each other. The first, Timeland, is a bit more electronic in its textures, although it does deviate here or there to bring us what I can only describe as goofy? Like, okay, there was that weird chanting section I played for you guys earlier, but there are also sections where it sounds like the band are hanging out in a British tea parlor, and where Stu literally whips out an ocarina like he's about to travel back to the dawn of the first day. Joey makes a bunch of EDM contributions, and... well, they're serviceable. I do not consider myself an authority on EDM by any stretch of the imagination, but it doesn't really feel like Joey's putting much of a Gizzard spin on things. Like, their previous song, Acarine, had such a neat outro shifting from a prog jam to a full-on rave. By comparison, the EDM here grooves, but it doesn't exactly feel built up at all. Like, truthfully, if I wanted to hear Joey go ham in Nadal like this, I'd just go listen to Bull Ant. The last minute 30 goes pretty hard, though. Smoke and Mirrors, thankfully, is a little bit better overall. It starts with a groovy shuffle between bass, drums, and synth, which wouldn't sound too out of place on quarters, before cascading down some lovely harp melodies into a rap section from Ambrose. Okay, I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised here by this. After all, since the band sops up influences like a sponge, it was only a matter of time before they would rope rap into the Giz verse, and Ambi had already had a bit of a pseudo-rap during the breakdown to Odd Life on KG, but yeesh, bro should have let this cook in the oven for a little longer. Skull emoji, fire emoji, skull emoji. He was clearly struggling to settle on a lyrical flow, especially apparent in the final rap section of the song. The EDM offerings on this song flow a little more seamlessly, especially from the first rap section till about 10 minutes in, but they still tend to go in one ear, out the other for me. Other than that, I honestly really like the section at about 12.5 minutes into the song of the slow duet between clean electric guitar and piano. Honestly, if they ended the song on this instead of another stilted Ambrose rap, I probably would have come away from the album with more of a positive impression. Instead, knowing what this entire project could have been if the band focused in a little more on cohesive tunes, I just feel... meh. Like, there was something here, but it's far too meandering for me to want to casually listen to it. I'll give the band this. The album definitely kills 30 minutes. And, you know, I'm sure there are Giz fans out there who really dig this album. That's perfectly fine, and I'm happy if you can find enjoyment out of it. As for me, though, well, I think a good point of comparison here would be Pink Floyd's Adam Hart Mother. The album's title track, much like the tracks on Made in Timeland, came together piecemeal, with the members of Pink Floyd gradually adding bits and pieces to flesh out a Western-sounding chord progression David Gilmour had written. Nick Mason and Roger Waters had to lay down a 23-minute backing track without splicing, since the tape machine they were recording to was still brand new. Even after guitar and key overdubs to this monster, though, the band still felt like the track was missing something, so they contracted Scottish composer Ron Geeson to write a backing score for full orchestra and choir. The result is... well, it's certainly a Pink Floyd epic, but alongside some of the stuff off Amagama, It's probably the most out-there, bloated, pretentious epic in their catalog. Like, don't get me wrong, I used to love listening to this song as a socially outcast prog nerd back in the day, but I can now admit that they
may have gone too far in a few places.
Hell, the members of Pink Floyd haven't been shy to denounce it in the years since, but ultimately, Adam Hartmother was important for them. An important creative kidney stone to pass before they could move on to their 70s winning streak. Maybe that's what Timeland is. Maybe eventually we'll get a King Gizzard album that does what Made in Timeland attempts, but better. Huh, I wonder what that could be. In any case, I'm sorry to Timeland fans, but I can't give this album any higher than a D, creative ideas though it may have. But fortunately for King Gizzard and their fanbase, the mixed reception of Made in Timeland was not long to stick around. See, the entire time the band were continually hyping its release, they were busy recording, even teasing, a far greater project, one which would not only revisit past sounds, but push the band into further technicality, into further genre experimentation. The world was reopening, and King Gizzard was keen to announce that they were back. Remember when I was talking earlier about the recording of Fishing for Fishies and how the lads started the process up at Tropical Fuckstorm's Backwoods Studios? Well, one night, presumably after a long day of recording and with a few beers in their system, the members of King Gizzard and Tropical Fuckstorm decided to jam together. For some reason, everyone in the room was wearing hats, and so, perhaps uncreatively, perhaps not, they would come to refer to what they were cooking that night as the Hat Jam. But the music would not stop there. In the year to come, King Gizzard would continue to build on the Hat Jam while sound-checking, and were really excited, maybe, that they could eventually develop it into a real monster in the studio once 2020 rolled around. So then COVID happened and basically shut down any hope of the Giz Boys going back in the studio for a long while. God damn it, Rona. Eventually, that day did come, though, and starting in June 2021, the band returned to the studio to bang out not just what had become of the Hat Jam, but also a number of ideas they'd shared over the phone via WhatsApp. There was a bit of a stir at the start of the process because of a number of rap demos Stu had brought to the table from sampling obscure vinyl with Ambi. And, I mean, to be fair, at a glance, these guys do not look like prodigious MCs at all. But this subsided once the band agreed that the theme of the record would be no theme. Oh god, it's another potpourri album, isn't it? Alright, now, to be fair, the band has spoken about their experience recording the album and how it was liberating to not have to compose music around a theme and just let the songs speak for themselves. As Joey put it,
we had just finished our last record, Butterfly 3000, and we're still navigating the pandemic all over the world. So, we'd go to our studio every day to keep our minds occupied. And in that sense, we just wanted to start experimenting with a whole bunch of different directions in terms of where to take the album conceptually, exploring genres, exploring sounds and vibes. Honestly, we couldn't just settle on anything at all, and then we decided to forget the concept and create this huge collection of miscellaneous pieces, and that's it. Once we freed ourselves of that pressure, it all came together very quickly. We found that we had so much music in us and this deep creative vein, and in the end we were just ready to give something really fun, and it was just an amazing album to make.
And when they'd finished making it in August, the band were clearly quite excited to show it off to their fanbase. They began posting a series of teasers on Twitter and Instagram hinting at the titles of their upcoming songs, even cheekily hinted that it would be releasing as a double album. A day before Halloween, they debuted a new metal song at a gig in Melbourne, which a lyrics post on their Instagram the next day later confirmed to be named Gaia. When the Timeland festival rolled around, they debuted 3 new songs at the event in addition to playing Gaia again, leading many to expect that an additional album other than Timeland was imminent. Sure enough, 3 days later, the band announced the release of a new album on April 22nd, Omnium Gatherum. What's it? Well, for those of you who aren't too well versed in Latin, it roughly translates to a miscellaneous collection of things. The band were wearing the fact that this was a potpourri album on their sleeves loud and proud in the same way they had in the past with titles like Oddments or Gumboot Soup. But what was even more stunning at the time was the fact that they simultaneously dropped the album's opening track, the the long-anticipated Hat Jam, now reconfigured in a new 18-minute-long form, the Dripping Tap. In the announcement hailing the imminent arrival of Omnium Gatherum, Stu would say that the album heralded a turning point in the band's career, an entry into their jammy period, as he phrased it. And listening to the Dripping Tap, it quickly becomes apparent why. Apparently, while creating this song, the band recorded themselves just going at it for an indefinite period of time, stitched together the backing instrumental from the jam's best segments, and then began adding overdubs on top of it. And the result is something truly stunning. The bands not only charge full speed ahead as they have in the past on tracks like Am I in Heaven or Robot Stop, but with each new section they try to bring something new to the table, whether it's an Allman Bros-esque twin solo or an extended champ breakdown. As I mentioned, the song is 18 minutes long, but it hardly ever feels like that. It's such a whirlwind. It's such an inspired rush of a song and shows King Gizzard in a position not just poised to surpass previous, more planned songwriting efforts, but to find a new possibility in their paths forward. Although, just to moderate your expectations, I should mention this is practically the only song like that on the entire album. The rest of Omnium Gatherum's material is relatively subdued and straightforward, if not inherently bad. My major issue with the album is in its pacing. Somehow, with the possible exception of KG, King Gizzard has never excelled at properly pacing their potpourri albums. Instead, it's common for them to radically shift between moods from track to track, producing serious mood whiplash. After Dripping Tap, for instance, the band explored the psych-pop bliss of the tracks Magenta Mountain and Kepler 22b before diving into the pounding, odd-metered rage of Gaia, before slipping back into the smooth, buttery tones of Joey's Ambergris, followed by the hard Dust Brothers vibes of Sadie Sorceress. We need to talk about the rap tracks. Now, look, I understand why these songs, Sadie Sorceress and the Grim Reaper, are divisive among the King Gizzard fanbase. As Joey said, it's a little weird for a bunch of Australian psych rockers to suddenly pivot into rapping about witches and reapers, but allow me to try and put forward a spirited defense. Y'all remember the Beastie Boys? Drop! Everyone loves the Beastie Boys. A little-known fact before they became practically the best white rap group of all time was that they were deeply immersed in the New York hardcore punk scene, rubbing shoulders with such bands as Bad Brains, the Dead Kennedys, and the Misfits. But they were gradually influenced by the rise of hip-hop around them, eventually signing to Def Jam and creating the Rick Rubin-produced License to Ill, one of the best-performing rap albums of the day. While their commercial success would lag in the years to come, the Beasties still maintained their cred among rock and rap fans, not just by sampling old rock music of the day, but a variety of obscure funk and R&B beats that even other black MCs wouldn't have thought to touch, and some of their own instrumental overdubs. In that regard, King Gizzard are just following in the Beasties' footsteps. Both Sadie Sorceress and the Grim Reaper slap, aided by the particular songs they sampled, but also by the various overdubs they added and the surprisingly smooth flow that both Stu and Ambrose deliver. Amby's clearly improved his chops since Timeland. One might even say he's spitting bars. But nah, the rap songs aren't the problem with this album. It's the damn second half, which is even more maddeningly inconsistent. If you thought the album's first 40 minutes was quite the series of mood whiplashes, you haven't seen nothing yet. Let's talk about the midway point through the album, Evilest Man. In principle, I like this song. It's meant as a takedown against probably one of the most twisted individuals alive today, the infamous right-wing media mogul, the man who ruined political discourse forever in at least 3 Anglophone countries, Rupert Murdoch. Now, if you've been paying the least bit of attention to my channel, you might already suspect that I'm the furthest thing from a Murdoch sympathizer, and you'd be right. But I just wish this takedown were a little more harsh. Instrumentally, it bounces between jaunty, synth-led parts and swinging psychedelic rock freakouts, which I guess is fine, but it doesn't really evolve anywhere else from there in its 7-minute runtime. Plus, the vocal melodies feel very flippant paired with the subject matter. Oh, Mr. Murdoch hacked my phone again. Guess I'll just... Fuck you, Rupert! See, this is what I mean. If Rupert Murdoch really were the evilest man, you think the band would be as pissed off at him as they were at our spiraling trajectory towards dystopia, but the track hardly commits to setting that appropriate tone musically. Consequently, whenever I try to listen to Omnium Gatherum in full, I kinda just check out when it gets to this song. If you're willing to stick around for the rest, though, there are some great cuts, hell, even runs of songs. Like, immediately after Evilest Man, we get 3 well-segged bangers in a row. The Garden Goblin is a cute, synth-heavy bedroom pop jam written by Cookie in his typical quirky pipe-eye manner, which bops, and I will hear no slander about the mob dance on this channel. It then leads right into the soulful, pretty shuffle-driven groove of Blame It on the Weather before getting even funkier still with Persistence, which, for my money, is the most underrated track on the album. It's just got such a steady, self-assured vibe and so much car-related imagery that it would make for an incredible song for cruising down an interstate highway, let alone for taking it easy. Then the Grim Reaper comes along, and it's a good song and all, but it just smashes the transitional consistency which had been going for the past few songs to bits. Much of the rest of the album feels so mid, though. Like, Ambrose's 2 big vocal lead contributions on the album, Presumptuous and Red Smoke, are boring. The former, despite a neat cameo from Stonefield's Amy Finlay on drums, who was then pregnant with Cav's baby, trails off into middle-of-the-road lounge music, while the latter is this psychedelic cloud of nothing, which is practically the most forgettable song in the King Gizzard discography. And in between those, we get Predator X, a killer ode to primordial carnivorous beasts of the sea. I love the metal tracks on this album as much as the next Gizhead, but they really stick out like a sore thumb here. Even more unfortunately, the bands don't quite stick the landing at the end. Second to last track, Candles, is brilliant, filled with layers of claves, shakers, and electric piano comping that'll really get your rump shaking. It reminds me of that one song Sunflower by Rex Orange County and how smooth and low-key it is. What would you call this sort of music? Chill out? Chill wave? All that matters is that it grooves. Until it transitions into a Latin-tinged instrumental track called The Funeral, which is just the same chord progression for 2 minutes with random acoustic noodling interspersed. It feels very much like an anticlimax, coming at the end of an hour 20's worth of music. So much so, you might not bother to stick around for the very end of the song when a familiar 60 BPM pulse returns. Oh god, no! No! I really wanted to like this album more than I did when it came out, but now, even a year later, if I'm going back to this album, it's on a track-by-track basis. Does it have great tracks? Sure, incredible ones even. The Dripping Tap, as we'll come to see later, is a band-defining behemoth of a song, much in the way Head on Pill was for the many years after its release, and the band's put forward a bunch of neat, soulful pop tunes which make great use of synthesizers and samples along with more quality metal. These tracks don't exactly go well into each other all the time, though, making for a chaotic listening experience from front to back. Plus, some songs are outright just undercooked or boring. I think in terms of Giz's potpourri albums, this one is definitely the best of the bunch for its sheer scale and ambition. But the band still have not figured out how to properly structure one so that it flows naturally. It's a hard call, but I think I need to put this in C tier. Granted, it's probably at the very top of C tier next to Fishies, but it's still inconsistent and messy enough where I can't quite put it in B tier. And that could have been it for 2022. For a few weeks after the album's release, the band were seemingly content to just hit the road, engaging once more in busy tours crisscrossing the United States and Europe and playing festivals, theaters, and other 1,000-seat venues for the first time in almost 3 years. But it was in the middle of one of those tours that Stu one day made a cheeky little post on the band's Twitter. 3 more albums this year. Somewhere in the bowels of New York City, a lazy orange catboy, then elbow deep in making a deep dive documentary series on the band Kiss, screamed with joy and fear at this announcement. well aware of what he would have to do in the future. Just a little break before we move on to those remaining 3 albums, though. I wanted to take some time to thank the thousands of y'all who've supported me in the past year or so. To think it's almost been a year since I began on my first Kiss deep dive, and now here I am, almost 3,000 subs, 14 or so patrons, and a number of Ko-fi contributions later, and it seems like y'all well and truly want more Resi content. Never in a million years did I think that I could pull something like this off, but you guys prove me wrong day in and day out with how much you enthusiastically receive my videos. If you're new here, though, and you like what you see, or if you're returning to the channel but aren't subscribed, which I understand quite a few of you are, why not hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you want to see more videos to come? If not, I always appreciate comments and likes. Both help my channel to grow and reach the eyes of more music lovers. If you really want to go the extra mile, though, and support me monetarily, I have a Ko-fi for one-off donations, as well as a Patreon with exclusive videos, photos, and script drafts which you can access for $2 a month, or $6 if you want to also ask me questions and participate in polls to select future video ideas. I've got a goal where if I hit 1,000 patrons or 50,000 YouTube subs by the end of the year, I'll make a follow-up series to my Kiss docu-series covering Kiss in the 90s and their reunion period. So if you want to help make that happen, I'd be grateful for your support. Anyways, where were we? As I've mentioned a few times now, the band had a large run of shows in the months after Omnium Gatherum dropped. First crisscrossing North America with a set of dates in April and May, well attended by enthusiastic Gizzheads. Apparently there were a few South American dates on the docket too, but it doesn't look like those happened. They did once more go to Mexico though, and they even played a damn marathon set though, so at least Latin America got some love. Sadly, the European run of shows they had went a bit less smooth. For one, Cavs caught COVID at the tail end of the American tour, which meant he was delayed in coming out to Europe for about a week as he recovered. Rather than rescheduling, however, the band decided to play their 2 shows in Greece with a drum machine. Going from 2 drummers to 1 drummer to no drummer in the span of 2 years, what a trajectory. Thankfully, Cavs was able to rejoin the band for Primavera Sound, and everything seemed smooth sailing from there. Hell, the band even stopped back in America briefly for Bonnaroo and made the 3-album tease while out there. But then things got even worse when, returning to Europe, Stu wrestled with a literal shitty situation. Crohn's disease. Apparently, the disease had afflicted Stu for years, but he was usually able to keep it under control while on tour. Unfortunately, this time, a combination of poor diet and work balance made his condition impossible to ignore, and the band had to cancel the remainder of their gigs until their slot at Desert Days. I really have to give it to Stu. The man's work ethic and stubbornness is truly the stuff of legends. He's been living with this bowel inflammation for so long and pushing his band further and further in spite of it all. And after just this one incident, Stu was profusely sorry to the fans and wanted to get back into the studio to jam with his mates immediately after. He just cannot keep a good man down. That said, as August rolled into September, there was one thing Stu could do by proxy of King Gizzard's social media. Announced that the band were dropping their 3 new albums next month. 3 albums in a single goddamn month. And they were about to go on tour in America at the same time, with marathon shows. The boys just can't help but keep on laying that gauntlet down, 6 days later, in addition to dropping a banger video, which I'll talk about more in a bit, they announced all 3 albums and the release dates. First on the docket, Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava. Or to save y'all the mouthful, Idpomol. It was to release on October 7th as the band snaked their way up the American West Coast. Now, this album has its origins sometime after the recording of Omnium Gatherum, where the boys decided to do what they did with the Dripping Tap, but even jazzier and more improvisatory. They would plot out a week dedicated to recording a few hours worth of jamming each day with nothing to go off of except a tempo, a key, and a mode. As Joey later explained,
there were elements of it early on, and it might sound like it, but we weren't really a jammy band. If Dripping Tap was the product of that style of trying to make music, we were like, well, how can we justify that and get an album's worth? What if we do the 7 modes of the major scale, with 1 per song or whatever, and the songs are all around 10 minutes? There's an album, easy. Because all the different scales have different timbre, tone, and mood, each song has a distinct identity. The work, it's just done for you, in a way.
What is a mode? Some of you might be wondering. Well, and this section's really going to test my ability to explain music theory, so bear with me. If your standard major scale is defined by a specific interval sequence of whole and half steps up, modes are what happen when you build scales from specific scale degrees. Play a standard C major scale? Congrats, that's C Ionian. Play that same scale but just from D to D instead of C to C? That's D Dorian. And so forth and so forth. This chart's an example of different modal scales you can make from the key of C. Pause to read it if you like, I'm not going to be testing you on it. And each major scale has a similar series of modes to it, by the way. Trust me, I went to Cat College for music. I know it's a lot. Point is, the band were jamming, and then later they went through all the jams, pulled the best material, edited it down, and made any necessary overdubs. Also, apparently they made lyrics collaboratively in a shared Google Doc, going off of nothing but the titular themes for writing prompts, which Lucas seemed to enjoy since he'd not written lyrics in some time. The entire thing was constructed with spontaneity as its bedrock, and dear Mother of God, the result is something truly stunning. I'm going to be entirely honest. I understand talk of modes just fine, but I never got how any musician of a tonal instrument got comfortable enough in their knowledge of different modal scales to improv with them off the top of their head, let alone for 4 to 6 hours at a time like these boys did. I wouldn't doubt if some of their jamming was hot garbage, but what's been assembled from their adventures into funky modal jazz are some of their most thrilling long tracks in their catalog. Ice 5, played in the key of G Dorian, is funky to its core, chock full of call and response vocals, precise guitar licks, and an unimpeachable groove from Caps holding the entire thing together. It's perfectly complemented by the music video which released alongside it back on September 7th, in which Joey takes a stroll through Greece and presumably lets the spirit of Dionysus flow through him. The D-Phrygian swing of Magma follows it up with a groovy, Egyptian-tinged slow burn fitting of the title. Honestly, we're spoiled in how they've interpreted it live since, but I do still really like the journeys the guitarists go on here, aided once again by Cab's rock-solid grooves paired with the hypnotic bass lines and vocal chants. In truth, though, I love the following volcano-related song much more, Lava. This song is in F Lydian, and if you know anything about the Lydian mode, it's that its sharp 4 gives its scales a very light, rising feeling to it. How fitting then that the band chose to use it as a setting for a literal eruption. The beginning with its sax and flute layers is a gorgeous fountain of sound. And then the song more gradually evolves from a tribal procession to another chant section where the band sing about reincarnation while Cabs goes wild on the drums.
The lover is death, the death is life. The lover is life, the volcano is death. The lover is death, death is life. The lover is life, the volcano is death.
The other really large songs of the album, Hell's Itch and Iron Lung, honestly, they're probably in the running for some of my favorite Gizzard tunes outright. The former is written in D Mixolydian, same as Sweet Home Alabama, come to think of it, And because of its minor dominant chord, the bands are able to glide along their chord progressions as smoothly as the itching that they're singing about the entire song. And shit, do they glide. As the instruments let loose and jam in between verse and chorus sections, the guitars, backed by the flute sometimes, pull out rich melody after rich melody. It just keeps building and building and building and building, and it was roughly by the 8-minute mark of the song where my mind did that thing like at the end of Ratatouille where the critic tasted Remy's soup, which reminded him of his childhood. Except replace Remy's soup with Hell's Itch, and Mother's Homemade Soup with the goddamn Gates of Delirium by Yes. The Giz Boys don't go hog wild with synths or metal scraps or anything, but they do hit upon that same adventurous spirit that the very best Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman or Pat Moraz solo trade-off sections gave off back in the 70s, and I can't get enough. Iron Lung, written in Aeolian, or also A natural minor, has an even stronger build-up, moving from a soft, jazzy opening with a pulse like a steady breath, to another dramatic jam which continually builds and builds and builds and builds in pressure until Ambrose and distorted electric guitars explode into the bridge. And then after that, it pulls back again, bringing the song to an end in the wake of that mighty storm. Iron Lung, in its very best moments, just sounds like a really fucking good jazz fusion band going for it and making expressive as hell jams. Like, maybe not quite snarky puppy levels, but all the boys have developed some serious melodic and harmonic chops, Stu included. Keep in mind, this is the man whose calling card for a long time was just... And he's been as active with the noodling just as much as Joey. It's seriously quite impressive how much he's stepped up. And of course, fucking Cav's holding it all together! Alright, tangent. I kinda brushed over it in the beginning since at this point it's just another one of the many wild fun facts about this band, but back in the day when Eric Moore was in the band, he was their second drummer and would always play facing Cavs when the bands performed live. It was a really iconic part of the band's live setup, even if it rarely amounted to much musically speaking other than 2-drum equal louder drum. There was like a few swapped hi-hats on Nuclear Fusion here, a few aux percussion parts on Polygon Dwanaland there, but otherwise Eric and Cavs were for the longest time just 2 really good garage rock drummers playing near identical driving beats really fucking fast. But then, especially with the release of Infest the Rat's Nest and the incorporation of Cav's double kick drum and even drum solos into the band's live show, it was becoming apparent that there was something of an imbalance in skill between the part-time manager, drummer, and label executive and the full-time drummer. I do wonder if that led to Eric's departure from the band in hindsight, if Cavs was just evolving musically in a way where for the band to evolve next, they needed both drummers on the same page and Eric just could not get there. Sad as it is that Eric is out of the band though, Cavs drumming has just improved exponentially since 2020 and Idpolmol, above any other album Giz has released since Eric's departure, proves it. Have you ever tried playing along to Ice 5 on drums? Good fucking luck keeping your snare hand constantly going if you're not warmed up for it. Cavs just keeps going and going and going like he's a goddamn Australian Energizer bunny, all while contributing some stellar fills too. Idpolmol as an album is a drummer's paradise. And yet, for all the praise I could heap upon it, the truth is it's not perfect, and that's largely owing to its opening and closing tracks, which, compared with the rest of the album, are only really so-so. Mycelium, the album's opener, is the Ionian tune on the album, or essentially it's just E-flat major. It's a very cheery, bouncy tune about mushrooms, but unlike most of the other tracks on the album, it hardly has any sense of progression to it. Cav's drumming is funky, but lacking in dynamics, while the rest of the band just plays a bunch of carefree licks on top of him. Stu says it was a challenge playing an Ionian tune, which wasn't too happy, to Disney, but, well, I'm sorry to say, fun as the song is, these boys are not about to beat the whistle while you work allegations. The closing track, Glee's 710, suffers from similar issues of repetition, but mode-wise, it's got the exact opposite problem from Mycelium. It's in a Locrian. Now, Locrian is a crunchy scale. It's what happens when the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th note in a scale are flattened from where they usually are in the corresponding major scale. So, here's a major, and now a Locrian. It's a very tense sequence of notes, so naturally Glee's 710 was the most difficult song to assemble. The band ended up going with a 7/4 and later a 9/4 swing over which they would gang chant the album's titular subjects, bring it all full circle. It's a valiant attempt at a closer, but to me it's all one long melange of repetitive motions and angular melodies. The bands aren't quite as adventurous here as on other tracks given their presumable unfamiliarity with Locrian. It's still a good song, just not nearly as wild as everything that led to that final moment. Idpolmol overall is a titan of a record, boasting some of the most impressive soundscapes and musicianship that have appeared on a Giz album to date. Tracks like Ice 5, Iron Lung, and Hell's Itch are brimming with such vitality that you can't help but want to nod along when you listen to them, and with such intricacy that you could dissect them for hours. Unfortunately, it doesn't leave the best first or last impressions, but as a collaborative effort between the whole band at all levels, this album really should be commended with how well it threads the needle between being artificially constructed and spontaneously created. I would certainly say that this delivers on the promise of Giz's jam period, expanding their ambitions even further in the process and leaving us with some of the most awe-inspiring music of their career. I'm going to put it in A tier. So that does it for the first album of October. What was next? Well, the band were finally about to make good on their promise to play marathon shows at Red Rocks after 2 goddamn years in the works. Problem is, they'd already blown their intermission music load a few months earlier with the Made in Timeland debacle. What would they do for these shows? Well, there was another album scheduled to be dropped roughly at the same time as these shows, one consisting of only 2 tracks and with a runtime of 30 minutes even. One whose title was a literal anagram for Made in Timeland. I am, of course, referring to... Sometime before Idpolmol, the band recorded another 2 jam sessions, this time centered around the same 60 BPM ticking clock pulse they'd used before on Made in Timeland. Unlike last time where anything went, this was far more of a band effort, with the Giz Boys solely reliant on their standard instrumentation of guitars, harmonicas, and the occasional background synth for both tracks. Also, the band were decidedly jamming at their own tempo, with the pulse in the background solely serving this time to help them create neat polyrhythms. It's interesting. Apparently, during recording, they'd have a click track going on in their ears, but also have a clock ticking down to visually reference roughly where they were in the countdown. Both tracks were debuted at the Red Rocks gigs, one per night, before being released on October 12th as Laminated Denim. The title is funky as hell. What the hell does it mean? Well, aside from the anagram that I brought up earlier, there's this one post on the King Gizzard subreddit where the OP suspects, since a lot of the album's lyrics concern temporal or interdimensional travel, it literally means bringing the space-time fabric, together. On a more practical level, its title lends to a funky, jean-stitched album cover with a clock sewn on top of what looks like Pangea. In fact, they even sold a number of copies on their website and at live concerts packaged in actual denim sleeves. They actually made goddamn Ginal, the absolute goddamn madman. Enough speaking on its aesthetics, though. Is the album really a better use of your time than the first Timeland album? Honestly, yeah. Like, for all intents and purposes, this is a back-to-basics King Gizzard record with extra steps. The Land Before Timeland is a very chill motorik jam, which is midway between Fishing for Fishies and Flying Microtonal Banana. It's got all these interweaving guitar melodies bouncing off of the ticking clock, all while the rock-solid rhythm section steadily chugs along. There's even a neat moment in the middle where the drums enter a cut-time groove and the layers of guitar over top play these pretty arpeggios. And then Hypertension, by contrast, is like an updated take on the Nonagon Infinity or Polygondwanaland sound, plowing ahead with cascading and ascending polyrhythmic guitar melodies. They're really both quite agreeable tracks, and you can easily find yourself moving to them both. Honestly, I can totally see this working as fitting intermission music between sets, where the crowd is presumably toking their mid-concert joints or sipping on beers and just vibing in anticipation before the band takes the stage again. The animations that frequent band art collaborator Jason Galea made for the countdown timers especially are dope visuals for a live concert. Both songs are really a great way to spend 15 minutes. Unfortunately, I kind of have to grade this one on a curve, given how few songs it actually has, so if you'll allow me to put on my nitpick glasses real quick, let's take a more critical look at this album's two halves. Yes, The Land Before Timeland is a very low-key and chill song. I like how the polyrhythms between the guitars bounce off of each other. It does take a lot of time to really unfold into its true splendor, though. Plus, there's a darker ending segment in the last 3 or so minutes that just sorta comes out of nowhere. I like it decently enough as a way to end the song, but it might have been fun if they'd teased such a dark progression earlier on in the song. Instead, it almost feels like a procedural afterthought, something randomly thrown in at the 3-minute mark to randomly ramp up the hype for the next set, like someone dimming the lights in the lobby before Act 2 of a play. I'm a bit more on the up about hypertension. Generally speaking. As I said, it's probably the most Nana-Gondwana-land adjacent song we've gotten in a while, and while I do vibe with it incredibly hard, the truth is you could hack out about 5 minutes from this song's total runtime and lose absolutely nothing. That's literally what the band have been doing when playing it live recently, shrinking it down to a 10-minute epic from a 15-minute one, and it still rips just as hard, if not even more so. At the end of the day, while they're far better songs, the tracks on Laminated Denim are still more so built for the function of playing during concert intermissions than serving as wholly satisfying listening experiences in their own right. So, at the end of the day, Laminated Denim is a far better time-based album than their previous such effort. I mean, not that it was a high bar to clear, but you know. But something is still missing. If King Gizzard ever decides to use Time for Polyrhythms in the future, I hope they go full concept album and write a series of songs that seg into each other for like 40 minutes or something. Not a series of vignettes, not too good if a little overbloated jams, but like, they should write their time-based equivalent of Nonagon Infinity. Done right, it would be a certified banger. As for Laminated Denim though, I'm gonna have to put it in B tier. Some great playing, but the boys have delivered stronger rock and jam material in the past. The next few weeks were definitely eventful as hell for the band as their American tour continued apace. They hit St. Paul, Chicago, Detroit, Toronto,
Montreal,
even a little city on the eastern seaboard called New York City. There they played their largest crowd yet at Queens Forest Hill Stadium to almost 13,000 people, your own resident Orange Catboy included. And they only continued playing to large, enthusiastic crowds of Gizzheads from there, hitting up Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Asheville, Atlanta, and New Orleans. It was at this last stop on October 27th, the day before the release of their next album, that the bands once again were their cheeky selves and decided to sell a few early pressings of it at merch booths. The crazy bastards had done it. 3 albums in 1 month, capped off by our final album today. Wait a minute, cut this shit. Man, what you gonna do now? What we're gonna do right now is go back. How far are you going back? Way back. As we go a little something like this. Hit it! Now, believe it or not, when the bands were in the middle of their first 5 albums in 1 year run back in 2017, they actually had a 5th concept plan for that year, but never completed it. Gumboot Soup was essentially what they put out instead in its place. But why did that missing 5th concept fall apart? As Stu would explain, we had it locked in to be the 5th record, and we recorded what we thought was going to be the album in 2017. It just wasn't fully realized at that time. We didn't have the musical vocabulary to actually complete this idea. We're kind of flicking between key like every chord change on every song. It's these 2 keys and they shouldn't be in tune with each other, basically. We're sort of flicking between them the whole time. Essentially, as Joey would say, think Giant Steps by John Coltrane. The chord changes on that song are basically a sequence of dominant tonic progressions in a series of different keys separated by a major third. And then there's something and my brain. Yeah, I kind of studied this stuff in cat college, but I ought to emphasize, I am a drummer. Basically though, King Gizzard had been cooking up some jazzy shit, but were only able to really deliver on it in 2022, now more capable musicians. The results of their deliberations, Changes, released officially on October 28th. In spite of its jazzy aesthetics, the album cover is literally covered in piano keys. It's important to know that this is not a jam record. No, unlike the previous two, every single part of this record was considered. It's more of a song cycle in Stu's words. But a song cycle themed around what? And also, the first letter of every track on here spells it out as well. The album is the band's musing on the concept of change, which, as this video no doubt shows, they are well acquainted with. So I suppose it's fitting that we begin with the album's thesis statement and opening track, Change. Once again, we have another 13+ minute song. God damn, the band were really ambitious with their runtimes this year, huh? But like I said, it's a very tightly considered 13 minutes. It starts off with a light shuffle section driven by keys and bass where Stu ponders why and how we change and urging a broader, more societal change towards a more equal global society. The second section, a more dissonant shuffle spearheaded by Cookie, arrives as a sort of challenge to the first, looking at the changes which are actually happening right now and wondering, is this what we call changing for the better? I love the key sounds here, it's very Scooby-Doo. The song then slows down for a section sung by Ambrose, which has a very strong R&B flavor to it, and all while he's singing aspirationally about nailing corrupt leaders to rights and spreading love. Then Joey comes along and delivers a motoric meets electronica section with some sprinklings of Pink Floyd in the lyrics. Big strangers passing in the street energy here. But God, do I love this groove. Again, it reminds me a lot of Yes, which is funny given that they also wrote a song about changes back in the day. The last 3 minutes of the song are probably my favorite part, though. After returning to the original theme, Stu earnestly asks what it would take to build an ark to take him and his friends away from all the chaotic changes constantly happening on Earth, and it's a very relatable moment. While there are times where I want to be as optimistic about change and our need to change both ourselves and society for the better, other times I would rather just tunnel in on myself and find some means of escape with friends. Change can be hard. It can be messy. It can make you want to panic, but there is a kernel of hope in seeking refuge in friends, even if friendships may not last forever. Together, you can find the strength to change. Together, you can make magic. The song literally ends on this jubilant chant and distorted electric guitar, a sound so Gizzard they could have literally recorded it on 12-bar Brews 10 years prior. A beautiful end to a beautifully made, beautifully paced song. What's even more neat is that the next 5 songs are essentially variations on a theme. According to Stu, each song is built from a piece of change, and certainly it's obvious that some are. Hate Dancin' is just the shuffled part of Change remixed, while Gandhi adapts the Joey section of Change into a full tune. The influence on the other tracks is a little more subtle, if almost non-existent, though I suppose one consistent through line is the main melody of Change. It comes back at multiple points on the record, such as on the bridge of Gandhi and the guitar solo to Exploding Suns. It's a really neat melody. I love all the turnarounds and how the band continually refigure it throughout. The songs aren't only musically linked, but thematically linked as well. Each song has something to do with a change, whether it's personal like the Wallflower to Dancer narrative of Hate Dancin' and the personal enlightenment found on Nobody, or apocalyptic like the environmentalist lament of AstroTurf and End of Days Ballad Exploding Suns, or even the mass feline hypnosis described on Gandhi. We'll get to that. But leaving aside all your usual Gizzard conceptual mumbo-jumbo, do the rest of the songs stand up on their own? Oh, absolutely. Hate Dancin' was a bit of a grower on me since it doesn't sound too much different from Change's first section, but its vocal melody is a damn syncopated earworm that makes you want to just get up and groove. Also, that section in the middle where Ambi is acting out arguing in his head over whether or not he wants to dance with a girl never fails to make me grin every time.
What the hell is coming over me right now? Feel like I'm about to freak out. From the waist down. No one care about what people think. Let them kick up stink.
AstroTurf, though, hooked me right away. Instrumentally, this is probably the most impressive song Giz have recorded to date. Go watch the music video for a rough approximation of the equipment they would have needed to pull all this off in the studio. Whether or not they did it live like in the video, the end result is still an undeniable cut of jazz funk, undergirded by a Cavs who's clearly listened to a bunch of Yusef Days. The tense chord progressions also lend themselves well to the lyrics to create one of King Gizzard's most potent environmentalist messages to date, a considerable feat given the competition. The lyrics lament mankind's desire to just paper over nature with AstroTurf, rather than confront their destruction of the environment. And the chorus, taking the POV of a freshly hatched butterfly looking for a place to breed, is honestly stunning. It's such an existential horror, seeing nature get swallowed gradually by man, but especially so from the point of view of a smaller creature. We then get No Body, which is such a well-crafted, laid-back rock tune. It owes as much to R&B as the Eagles' Hotel California, not just in its easy backbeat, but in the emotive lead guitar parts in the back half of the song. For a song about just allowing yourself to drift away spiritually, it's appropriately heady. Things pick back up with Gandhi, which, like I mentioned, is built on the motoric section of Change, but bangs so much harder. This is some quality electronic rock, driven once again by Cav's energetic fills and an odd-metered sequencer pattern a la something off of Butterfly 3000. The lyrics are befitting of the song's manic energy. Okay, so Gandhi, right? It refers to Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite often passed by domestic house cats onto humans, which has the effect of making them like cats more. There is a non-zero chance that Toxoplasma gondii is what's influencing you to watch this particular catboy right now. More practically, it can infect rats and make them more susceptible to being hunted by cats, a tidbit Stu cheekily references in the bridge. Cute biology reference aside, that line may also just be a reference to Infest the Rat's Nest. Wouldn't be the first time they made a shout-out like that, #Gizverse confirmed. Exploding Suns is equal parts eerie and beautiful. Stu and Ambrose bounce off of each other in the verses to instill an impending sense of dread for absolute darkness over top the most relaxed acoustic instrumentation on the record. And then the break section where the synths come in and they sound like stars growing into red giants adds to this beautiful dread. Such an interesting combination of sonic textures and moods. You leave the song equal parts horrified of a future where the sun just goes out, but fascinated by the science behind it. You're not left with much time to ponder it, though, when the band crashes back in with the album's closer, a reprise of Change fittingly titled
Short
Change. Some people have criticized the album for ending like this, but I think it's fitting, especially since Change practically undergirds the rest of the album anyways. Plus, in the context of the rest of the album, the repetition of Change's first verse here makes us reflect on all the various changes discussed. It's almost like a checklist. As the case studies on the album reveal, change is everywhere, both within us and without us, and it is incumbent on us to welcome it, if not always with open arms. Around the time Changes came out, the band put out a limited-run documentary on Vimeo called Sleeping Monster, which follows the band during the recording of the album. There's an entire extended cut at the end where the band supposedly get the backing instrumental for Change in a live take, and it's the stuff of legends. But what stunned me even more was the documentary's frank discussion towards the end of the future of King Gizzard. Lucas is interviewed, and though the fanbase rightly thinks of him as a damn king and knows he always holds it down on bass, he expresses doubts in his own abilities as a member of the band, and even if he'll remain in the band's long term owing to his increased commitments raising his daughter. It certainly wouldn't be the first personnel loss the band would suffer given Eric's departure a few years previous, but the more of the original friend group that departs from the band, the more we have to wonder, when will King Gizzard end? Stu gave an optimistic answer to this question in the documentary, that King Gizzard could theoretically go on forever in any configuration, that anything could be King Gizzard, and with the past 13 years as testament, I could possibly believe that. All the same, these moments now where the band are grooving and jamming as a sextet, they won't last forever. Sure as the sun rises in the east, King Gizzard will change again, and changes, I think, is them making peace with that. And all scored to some of the best jazz fusion fiddling this side of Steely Dan. Perhaps this is a premature declaration, but I feel comfortable saying that Changes is an S. It's a work of true artistic maturity. And that does it! That's it for my ranking of all of King Gizzard's studio albums released to date. Once again, I have to say, it was really fun to revisit the band after such an eventful year in their history. Somehow they pulled it all off. Not just the albums, but the tours, the merch, everything. The band's indie rock empire continues to grow unabated, illnesses and logistics be damned. No doubt the band have earned another year-long break after that. Wait, fuck, they've already debuted a new song on their recent tour in Europe. And now they're saying that their next album is finished. And now they're talking in magazines about not just dropping another metal album this year, but a more techno-focused album as well. God damn it, alright, fine. I'll review the albums as they come out, but I'm not going to do that here. If you want to hear my full opinions on the latest Giz albums when they drop, as well as where they'll rank on my tier list, you're going to have to subscribe to my Patreon. Again, it's only $2 for access, but I guarantee that, in addition to ad-free videos, you'll get exclusive content, including those reviews, as well as this mini documentary I made on the solo careers of Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, after both left Kiss for the first time. Or if you cannot pay, smash that subscribe button, click that bell, like and comment below, and maybe even share me with your friends. But in any event, we're done on YouTube for today, but well, I still have a bit more to say about King Gizzard. You know how I've largely neglected talking about King Gizzard's live concerts in this video? I feel like that's doing them a grave injustice. If I'm going to truly tell the story about the band's evolution and persistence as musicians, the studio albums are only one half of the story. Next time on this channel, I'm going to take us through the history of King Gizzard's live gigs, the songs they've played, the countries they've visited, and the evolving philosophy of their performance in between.